Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to today's talk, Climate Change Causes Flight. My name is Michael van Nisserday. I'm a coordinator at VIDC, responsible for migration and development, and with a regional focus on the Middle East. Today's event takes place in cooperation with VIDC and the Hauptbücherei Wien. VIDC is an Austrian network of NGOs and individuals who engage for women's rights and humanitarian aid. I would especially like to thank Claudia Thalmeier from VIDC for the very good teamwork. Thank you, Claudia. And the Hauptbücherei Wien, like always, for the very good support in organizing. And I would like to take this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to my colleagues at VIDC, who have been very active in helping me to organize and carry out the event, especially Irene Hochauer-Poda and Mael Nausner. Thank you very much. A special thanks goes also to the Austrian Development Agency, the Austrian Development Corporation, for financing today's event. But now it's time to welcome our distinguished speakers on the podium. Paula Banerjee, welcome. Pato Kelesitse, welcome. Simon Bunchuay-Peth, willkommen. And of course, Daniela Paredes-Grijalva, the moderator. Daniela has also organized the panel, by the way, and so she's not only moderator today, but also organizer of the panel, and we work together in preparing everything. Daniela Paredes-Grijalva is a fellow and researcher at the Institute for Social Anthropology of the Austrian Academy of Science. For her PhD project at the University of Vienna, she investigates how immobilities relate to environmental change in Indonesia. She has previously worked on transnational migration, gender, and social protection as a researcher and practitioner. And she's a consultant since this year to the VIDC, and she arrived 11 days now, ago from Indonesia, where she has been for her research, for her field research, 3 months, I think, and she's also working on the issue of migration and climate change. The talk this evening is also a pre-event for the development conference at the University of Linz, which begins tomorrow, at which Paula and Pato will also speak on a forum organized by VIDC and VIDC, and which has been also curated by Daniela together with me and Claudia. As mentioned before, today's talk and discussion will be held in English and translated simultaneously into German. In the question and answer session later on, please feel free to raise your questions, also in German, not only in English, therefore. Ladies and gentlemen, even though the effects of climate change are felt worldwide, communities are impacted unequally depending on their location. Poorer countries in the global south, which are less able to protect themselves from the effects of the climate catastrophe, are particularly affected, even if they contribute hardly anything to global emissions. We are seeing this right now with the floods in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, or the devastating drought in the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia is a good example, and we will hear later on, I think, a little bit about it. The issue is also the topic of the COP27, which is taking place right now in Sharm El Sheikh in Egypt. However, we can be very suspicious about the results of this conference, like the conferences before. But in fact, there's actually no time left for prevention, as climate scientist Adel Najam pointed out at the VIDC event last year. By talking about climate change, I quote him, as a future issue, we fool ourselves into thinking that we have time to act. Moreover, because the world has been unwilling to mitigate to the threat of global climate change, we now live in the age of adaptation. What does it mean? We will hear later on. And of course, it's even more true than last year. So this is one starting point for our discussion today. But what does that mean in regard to displacement? And what does it mean in regard to labor migration? We will hear about this later on. You all know, you're all aware that Austrian, European politics are large parts of the public present the image that the climate crisis is only a problem mainly because additional refugees would come to us. We all know that is maybe only half of the truth. In reality, most people remain in the region or could not get to safety at all. Women and children are particularly at risk of being left behind as a trapped population. This is also something we will discuss. But at this point, I would like to end with my introduction and point out that there's are feedback sheets on your seats, which I ask you to fulfill after the panel discussion so that we know and learn from your critique. Yeah, I wish us all an interesting evening and hand over to our moderator, Daniela Paredes-Grijalva. The floor is yours, Daniela. Thank you.
So much. Am I on? Yes. Thank you so much, Michael, for that lovely introduction. It's a pleasure for me to work together with WIDE and VIDC again this year. Thank you, members of the audience, for showing up today. We're still in this post-COVID adaptation phase, I guess, where we're still figuring out what goes, what doesn't. It's my pleasure to moderate today's panel discussion on the topic of climate crisis and flight. We're definitely not alone with these topics today. As Michael just mentioned, and as you are well aware of, the UN annual meeting on climate, COP27, is taking place this November. So in a way, the whole world is talking about the issues that we're discussing today. Climate change is here and there. But what does it look like? What does it feel like? The impacts are as different as the ecosystems in our world. The structural and historical inequalities that shape our social, cultural, and economic lives continue to deepen or broaden the gaps between the rich and the poor, with a million different shades in between. So when climate change impacts are felt in a given region, they are done so in different ways by different people. So the possibilities they may have to adapt, to respond, to prevent, to react, to mitigate, or not, are again different. And climate change, as we know, is not only a matter of technical expertise on the weather patterns. And that's precisely why tonight we've invited 3 very special guests to discuss climate change, mobility, migration, and displacement, with a particular lens on inequalities and the gendered ways in which people can or cannot migrate in the age of the climate crisis. To my right, we have Paula Banerjee, senior researcher at the Calcutta Research Group, best known for her work on women and borderlands in forced migration. She's a professor at the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Calcutta, one of South Asia's largest and oldest universities. She will also be joining us at the Development Days in Linz, and we're very happy to have you today. Pato Kelesitse, here also to my right, advocates for climate justice with a gendered lens. Conversation and communication are her primary tools. She's the host of the Sustain 267 podcast. I recommend you take a listen. A series of climate change and sustainability conversations with Africans to amplify their voices and solutions within the climate justice movement. She will also be joining us in Linz for the Development Days and then straight to COP27 at Sharm El Sheikh. So if you have some messages, she can take them. She can take them for us. Simon Bunchuay-Peth is a human geographer and migration researcher based at the Department of Geography and Regional Research at the University of Vienna, moving freshly to Vienna, still discovering the city. And he's been involved in various research projects on this topic in Ethiopia, Bangladesh, Thailand, and Singapore. We're also very happy that you can join us today. So what we're going to do is I'm going to invite you to embark on a boat, all of us. The first session, the first round, the first boat ride will be an input from each of the speakers. We're going to hear a little bit about what does this look like from their particular context, from their particular backgrounds and expertise. Then we will embark on a second round where we will have from the podium a discussion, debate, reaction, question. And in the final boat ride, dear audience members, I invite you to embark with us with your responses, comments, messages, questions, whatever they may be. So, we will start with this short input by each speaker. We'll hear what it looks like on the ground or on the water. How have people and governments responded, for instance? What can we do about it? Where are the challenges? But more importantly, the inputs from your particular expertises. We will start with Paula, Pato, and then Simon. Yeah? With no further ado, Paula, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I have to start with a huge thank you to Michael, Dani, and everybody here, because not only did they make it possible for me to come here and speak, they have been such wonderful hosts. And we seldom see such acceptability from the global north. And I have to begin by saying, I am an adversarial person, and I am angry at the injustice that is happening today in the name of climate change. Because it is not just climate change, it is a question of people's dignity, it is a question of people's life. So it goes much beyond climate change, it's a question of international justice. I will begin with a few numbers from my region. In the recent heat wave, 18 million people were displaced in South Asia. And when you talk of displacement, if 5,000 people come to Europe, it's a crisis. If 5 million people are displaced, it's not a crisis in the global south. That's the level of our understanding, you know. And when the world thinks about how we will cope with 5,000 coming into our country, we think about how we will cope with 5 million being displaced as a result of this chain of events that starts or is continued with climate change, but never stops there. Some examples. During COVID, the world talked about social distancing. We constantly heard, distance yourself, keep 6 feet distance. How would you socially distance in a region that has the highest density of population in the world? Bangladesh till now has the highest density of population. And as I said, pandemic can also be traced to climate problems, and pandemic never comes by itself. There's a huge impact on climate. We, in my region, where I come from, the belly of the beast, had 2 major cyclones. To keep people safe, we had to take them and keep them in schoolrooms, one right next to the other. I know about one particular schoolroom where there were 40 lactating mothers. Nobody cared about whether it's lactating mothers or not. They were lumped together with everybody else. During the cyclone Amphan, young girls were displaced who were, going to be migrant laborers. They were displaced. You know what their greatest problem was? How would they handle menstruation? Displacement, and nobody talks about menstrual health. The most number of disease that women faced as a result of these cyclones was urinary tract infection. We never talk about that. We only talk about COVID, climate change, development problems, and we constantly compartmentalize it because it is easy for us to deal with that way. When we deal with problems with development, one compartment, then we never connect the dots because connecting the dots would be a very difficult experience for people both in your country and in my country. Because once you connect the dot, you have to figure out where your responsibility lies. Today, with COP27, we are talking about loss and damages. For crying out loud, it's not a dole. What is being demanded is what is just. Because I will tell you about a cycle. Climate change brings in these cyclical forms of displacement. One country, India, starting from January to September, we had heat wave. And that kind of heat wave meant urban deaths in hundreds, because a lot of people don't have homes, they live in streets. Therein lies the problem, this endemic inequality. You start with this endemic inequality, and when you are sitting in the streets, this sun rays, they make you have sunstroke, and then you're dehydrated, then you cannot go to the hospital, then you die as a result of that. People who are farming, the farmers, they get into a situation where there's widespread drought. Bengal, where I come from in Bangladesh, is the belt where rice is grown for the entire region. This year, we did not grow even 40%. We could not plant even 40% of the rice, of the paddy that was required or that is usually produced there. And people, the farmers with some resources, when they planted the paddy, they were happy at least some food will come. And then in the month of September, you had massive floods. So when you're supposed to harvest, it's massive flooding. And then we say climate change. Because what happens is, prices go up, and then we don't connect it to climate change. We say inflation is happening. As a result of this inflation, the poorer people do not get the food that they deserve for the life of their children, for their lives, and for their dignity. Because nobody likes to beg, nobody likes to borrow, nobody likes to steal. But they're brought down to that animal-like existence because we are not understanding. We understand it very well, but we are not prepared to accept the consequences of what is happening, because climate change is not just climate change. Climate change is actually a disaster for resource sharing. And only the powerful get the resources. By powerful, I also mean the family elders, largely masculinist groups of people, where women, if you have, in the context of South Asia, and I'm pretty sure that should be true throughout the world, when you're dragged to that abject level, when you have a plate of rice, the maximum amount goes to the men and the boys, because they are supposed to be the breadwinners of the family. But that is no longer the truth. I will tell you how. During COVID-19, migrant laborers, and when I talk of India, South Asia, it's always in millions. It's not hundreds. So 400 migrant labor, 400 million migrant labor became displaced as a result of this. They started walking, come the heat. They fainted in the road, they died in the road. Those who became maimed, or those who were so traumatized, who could not go back in the next cycle, who do they send but their teenage daughters? So women are so in certain ways vulnerable, because their sexuality is used by their family to resource generate. Then they're asked to move out, because women send most amount of remittances. And during this phase of climate change, 49 million women lost jobs. 49 million from the context of South Asia. And yet, nobody really talks about it as a gender problem. It is a gender problem, because as I keep saying, the whole responsibility of putting food on the table, not on the table, on the floor, because most of South Asia, they sit on the floor and eat, they can't afford a table, is the responsibility of the women. It is, to look after the old, the infirm, the challenged like me. it is the women of the family who look after them. The women earn, and it becomes a family income. So yet, when there comes moments when, as a result of extreme climate, people are thrown out of jobs, when the jobs come back, the preference is for the men. You always say it's the men who will bring in bread, butter for the family, but when family income comes, it is actually the women whose income is shared. So, there is a huge disparity. I am not saying that in the context of South Asia, it is only gender that is a problem. No, this location itself makes it very problematic. Look at Bangladesh. It has cyclical patterns of flood and drought. Look at India, suffering endemic drought this year, not just in Bengal, in Kashmir, in the highlands, with climate that goes below zero. We did not have enough cold for the production of fruits like apples. Then look at Pakistan. You have another level of flooding. I mean, just study South Asia, you will see all impacts of climate change there. Not just flood, not just droughts, cyclones, tsunamis. When in 2004 we had a tsunami, people were trying to cope with it and manage about how to share resources and how to give aid. And they talked about islands. Suddenly they discovered 3 of those islands don't exist. They have disappeared. So it is that shocking. And, it doesn't come once in a decade. It comes in incessantly every year. We had Ayla, we had Amphan, we had Nargis, we had all kinds of these beautiful names with really shoddy, rotten cyclones happening. And yet we do not have resources to prepare ourselves. We talk about the resilience of the population, but what does how much time do I have? Okay, what does resilience actually mean? Think of the term. You're putting the onus of coping on the people itself. We have to talk about adaptation, because adaptation is where you have to put in resources so that people can adapt themselves, and there has to be long-term planning, because some of the most vulnerable are people who are the migrant workers. They have to migrate, not just in South Asia. I recently wrote about this, the Pacific Islanders. Look at their situation as a result of climate change. And, since my time is coming close, I will tell you one thing. The pandemic, if nothing else, it has showed us that the world is connected. The problems that we are dealing with, if you don't deal with that, the problems will come to you. So the only way to look at solutions is to think globally. We are no longer bound. We are actually a soft frontier community. There are no frontiers, there are frontier regions. And unless we, as the thinking community, sit together as people and produce movements, nobody will listen to us. They will divide us into South Africa or into Africa, Asia, etc. And they will say, okay, these are the people who want the dole, without taking the responsibility of why is this money necessary. And they will say, do we put it in Africa or do we put it in Asia? And constantly this game of divide and rule will go on. Divide and use your power to give a little bit here, a little bit there, and manage the global community. The only solution to that is to form a global citizenship for democracy, for justice, for movements, so that it can lead to ethical production of democracy and peace and justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. Well, with that short input, you actually took us through so many tidal waves up and down. Thank you, Paula, for also bringing up the issue of migrant workers, decent conditions for work, which is maybe not something that we automatically think of when we think about climate change, displacement, and migration. Pato, I invite you to join us on the boat.
Great, thank you for the invitation. Good evening, everyone. I'm also going to start by saying thank you so much to the VIDC team, and you, Paula, and you, Claudia, for inviting us here and hosting us here. You've been so hospitable. Yeah, and then that was a pretty difficult opening to follow by Prof. Paula. But I'm also going to start with some figures. So I think it also speaks to the whole thing of responsibility and accountability. So 3% of Africa's contribution to, well, of the 100% emissions, currently Africa is only contributing about 3%, although they'll be the worst affected. Only 1% of historical emissions that have got us where we are today have been contributed by the African continent. And then when we talk about displaced people, in 2021, 2.6 million were displaced in sub-Saharan Africa due to climate-related disasters, and that study was by internal displacement organizations. So again, going back to, we're not talking internal on our continents, we're talking millions. And again, what's a crisis? Who qualifies to have a crisis? Still on numbers, a predicted 85.7 million climate migrants in sub-Saharan Africa by 2050. And yeah, the top 5 internally displaced people due to disasters are in African countries. Over the past 4 decades, weather-related disasters in the SADC region, which is just southern Africa, left 2.47 million people homeless. I'm from Botswana, where our population is about 2.3 million, so that's an entire country homeless, for context. And even though these numbers are so high, there's data poverty in Botswana and in Africa. If you look at a lot of reports, you will see that that certain data is missing. So although these numbers are so high, they're conservative. So the reality of it is the real numbers are way higher than this. And then I really like the example of the boat. It speaks to something that I was going to say just now. Prof. Paula talked about how this is a global problem. There's a phrase I heard last year that really resonated, where all of us, yes, were affected by climate change, but the phrase goes, same storm, different boats, which speaks to this. So in this storm of the climate crisis, there are people in 200-foot yachts and butlers, and then there are people who basically have something like this, which survival is not guaranteed and at high risk. And then when we also talk about migration, inequality again comes in. When we talk about moving, for some reason, when we talk about moving, everyone thinks we want to come to Europe. We don't. It's not just a European problem. It's a thing of if you're desperate enough to have to leave home, because we have to be realistic. These are not people who want to leave home. If you're forced to leave home, there are certain things that make it even more difficult. So let's look at passport power. Just coming into the EU region is quite a job. You need actually, today, when you get home, just go on and look at the visa requirements for getting into EU. The list is literally this long. So if you're desperate, places like this, how easy are they to access? Financial resources. If you're going to move, you're going to need financial resources. How far can your money take you in desperate times when you've been a victim of the climate crisis that's taken everything you own, taken whatever little infrastructure is where you are? You're not leaving the region. Even if you wanted to, you don't have the resources to leave the region. Race. That comes in where it's like a crisis has struck again. India has crisis. Africa has crisis, but then whose tears are worth running for? Whose tears are worth opening borders for? Whose tears are worth mobilizing around? Whose tears are worth opening your borders, providing funding, and helping them migrate? And then other ones, geographical location, rural versus urban. Urban, you're relying a little less on the environment, although you are relying on the environment, whereas rural, like you said, if you're in rural and agriculture is one of the worst affected sectors, if you don't have yield that year, you don't even have resilience. You have invested your money into that year's yield. That means you've got very little resilience. So all of this, it's a thing of, there's so many levels to the climate crisis that even when migration has to be done and migration comes in as a form of adaptation, it's such a limited form of adaptation. And then these people who I've shared with you some of the challenges and different levels of challenges that they face, then they migrate. And then people are like, oh, they're going to migrate and come to our country, or they're going to come to our region. Firstly, those communities already most communities think they don't have enough resources. What displaced people are arriving to, usually it's no social protection, because technically you don't even exist in that country. Sacrificing human rights. You're going to exercise your rights in whose land? Even if they accept you as refugees and so forth, you're given like a 2x2 piece of area and they're like, don't leave here. So your dignity, your lack of personal security, you're exposed to discrimination, you're vilified by communities who already had problems, and then now because you're here, it's like, no, it's them. You're a cheap political point where if politicians are not delivering, they then say, well, we would deliver, but it's these people who are taking what we would be giving to you. So this is what people are walking into. And then when we look at responses, right now, especially with the loss and damage conversation happening, let me check my time, okay. With the loss and damage conversation happening, there's a lot of no reparations, is it really fair that we need to be doing all of this for the countries that were affected and all that jazz, what are they doing? I'll entertain it. So if we look at what Africa is doing currently, East Africa is doing a great job because they've realized that climate-fueled migration is not something that you can address as a single country. It's regional. People are going to go to where the borders are open or where it's easiest accessible. And East Africa came together in 2020. They signed the Kampala Ministerial Declaration of Migration, Climate Change, and the Environment. What this then does is it makes it easier for climate migrants to move into different countries. And then one may think, but then that means they're giving away resources. But what you really need to look at this as is that those countries are building insurance for themselves. Should Kenya be hit by a crisis, their basket of resources is not only limited to their borders. They have the region to lean on. Also, yeah, they've got the region to lean on, and this then applies to the different countries. And then by having it as a regional solution, that means when one country goes through it, by dispersing those people across the different countries, there's only so much that each country has to bear in terms of how much accommodation is made. And then there's also the free movement of persons in the IGAD region. Again, this was one of the first few papers that made an accommodation for climate migrants, not only as refugees, but looking at the reality of that climate migration is now a thing and not just refugees. So yeah, those are two of the examples that I wanted us to consider. We cannot address climate migration as nations, as nations alone. We need regional, and then at regional, we need global. Also with global, the global north needs to stop playing victim, first of all. But also, we need to look at how do we work together. We don't want handouts. We want to work, we want to earn our stuff, we also don't want it stolen from us. So how do we work together to ensure that climate migrants, when they arrive wherever they may arrive, are not looked at as a liability? And then the last thing now is when we look at migrants, we tend to look at them as liabilities. I'm going to speak about it in economic terms because, as we know, unfortunately, reality proves time and time again that money does make the world go round. So if we're looking at migrants as liabilities who are coming into certain spaces to take your resources, to take your jobs, to take your homes and so forth, that might not be the best way to look at this issue. What if you looked at people who come, what if the responses that were extended to climate migrants ensured that instead of looking at them as liabilities, they become assets? So these are people who worked where they came from. So these are skills that you're gaining. This is labor that you're gaining. This is knowledge that you're gaining. And then also, when we look at how to host these people, we make sure that our responses are rooted in justice and human rights and dignity. So not just the tents and the camps, but these people are afforded rights to work and education, right to freedom of movement, right to own property and be productive members of society. That way, like you said, with the remittances, they're able to send money back home, and I'm sure most people want to go back home. That also makes going back home at a future date a reality if from where you are, you're able to be a productive member of society and an active member of contributing to the country's GDP. So if we make accommodations for people to migrate and build lives, they're not only building those communities, but they're also rebuilding the communities that they have left back home. So let's not leave assets to be idle. And then in conclusion, you spoke earlier about COVID showed us that we're global. I think what COVID also showed us was what's possible when there's will, what's possible when there's political will, what's possible when people want to act, and how fast governments can move. Everyone will tell you they don't want to work with governments. Governments are slow to move. But I mean, governments were doing acrobatics you've never seen before. There were packages, there was money all of a sudden available. So it shows that when there's will, these things can happen. The war in Russia and Ukraine also shows us what is possible with migrants. Not only it's a lesson that we can take globally of what does it take for us to respond to crisis? What does it take to respond to people who've been displaced? And it's an example of what is possible. Let's look at what's possible and make that the reality for people who need to move, for people who are displaced. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Pato. Again, we took us on not the same boats. The point was they're different boats, the same storm, but different boats. Thank you for bringing also these two examples. By now, it will be already very evident that the mainstream narrative of climate change causes mass international displacement of people is a little bit more complicated, right? There's so many other aspects to consider. We've heard of two regional examples of international agreements of free movement or regulated and safe migration. We're going to move on now to hear from Simon, and then keep your thoughts and questions and responses for our second boat ride. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you very much for the boat. Paula and Pato, thank you very much for your input. I mean, it really illustrates, on the one hand, kind of the variety of aspects you have to look at, but you also kind of showcase the challenges we face, especially we as migration researchers. We are often asked about these numbers, and that's where I want to go with my inputs at the beginning. I want to kind of showcase two aspects which I think are really important in the debate. One is a question of kind of a definition and how to kind of figure this out, and the second part is about the complexity of migration decisions. So let me pick up the question of today's evening: does climate change causes flight? Oh boy, as a researcher who's thinking and researching about this for about 10 years, I can't give an answer even after these 10 years, because it really depends on so many aspects and factors. One answer can be, yes, climate change can lead to human mobility and migration, especially if you look at fast onset events such as floods, wildfires, for example, in California is also an example where you can see that quite directly. But at the same time, the exact same climate event can lead to the opposite. It can lead to immobility. You mentioned, Michael, the trapped population. The Hurricane Katrina is one example of that, which hit the US and Barbados in 2005, where some social groups were trapped, actually, and intersectionality, a question of race and social background, which you mentioned, was a decisive factor in that regard. Then as a geographer, I have to bring that up. Sorry, a little bit technical. There's the question also, what is climate change? Yeah? So climatologists differentiate between climate change, which is man-made, anthropogenic climate change, and climate variabilities, which are typical natural variations in the climate system. And this differentiation is quite important also to keep in mind, because it has an impact of how can we actually deal with these impacts. Because if we tackle something which is where we think it's related to greenhouse gas emissions, but at the end it's not, there are other reasons behind it. We have to be aware of that. On the other hand, it's also important with regard to the question who's actually responsible and how can we deal with it on the social-political scene. So. And what this makes this quite difficult also for migration researchers is to bring these two sides together. The World Meteorological Organization defines climate as the average weather of a time span of 30 years. And most climate models which are used take 100 kilometer squares. You all can imagine that migration is far more dynamic time-wise, but it's also far more diverse space-wise. So it's really, really hard to properly correlate climate data with migration data, but that's what's quite often done when we create these numbers, which we hear out there. And that actually brings me to the second point, the question of complexities. We as a migration researchers, I don't know, maybe you face that also from time to time, we often say this mantra, okay, migration decisions are really complex, and then other people sometimes respond to us, yeah, you always hide behind this mantra, everything is so complex. So that's why I want to give two examples to showcase this complexity. Let me bring you to a case in Ethiopia where I did research 10 years ago. Ethiopia, a country in the Horn of Africa, around about 80% of the population lives in a rural setting. So we can consider the livelihoods they have as something which is really climate sensitive. People there really feel when something is changing. And so I went to a region called Degadamot, really in the highlands, and the climate change they faced there was in particular changing rainy patterns, erosion in combination with erratic rains, often also combined with hail and frost, so it's pretty much highland actually there. And when I did the research, I regularly came up about stories about whole families disappearing quite quickly. It's like overnight they were gone. And it really puzzled me, like, okay, what happened there? And it took quite a while. After a lot of talks and interviews, I could find a pattern. And the pattern was that all these families were part of saving circles. So I'm not sure how much you are familiar with saving circles, but it's a very common measurement in development cooperation. For example, people would combine in groups, and then every month they would contribute a certain amount of money, and then the members of the saving circle take turn in taking the whole money and invest it in livelihoods. So in the case of Degadamot, usually it would be investing in livestock, in sheep, because that's kind of the typical livestock in that area. But then the problem was that in a combination of overgrazing, environmental change in the form of erratic rains, which lead to a certain type of erosion, led to kind of an increase of a deadly animal disease. This disease is called blackleg, and the wicked nature of this animal disease is that you don't see any symptoms. So actually your sheep, they will die in a matter of hours. So, and what happens is that some families, they lost basically the sheep in a matter of very few hours, and that means a core part of your livelihoods is gone, just like this. And then these families, they feared about the pressure of not being able to contribute to these saving circles anymore. So their decision was, obviously involuntarily, to pack all their stuff and to vanish overnight quite quickly. So now I had this case. How do I call this? Is it migration out of poverty? Is it environmental migration? Is it migration due to social pressure? All these factors play a role here, right? So that's just one example where I think we have to always kind of understand the complexity of these migration decisions and contexts. And also an interesting example, one topic which we seldomly talk about, or we should talk about more, the topic of maladaptation, which is also quite important, I think. So the last example I want to point out here is also from Ethiopia, this time from the south of Ethiopia. We did research with the Nyangatom. Nyangatom is a ethnic group of agro-pastoralists, so they are kind of leading a semi-nomadic lifestyle. The climate change they faced was in a similar way also in irregularities of rain, but then mostly droughts and water scarcity. So one could guess that pastoralists and nomads, they are quite experienced in moving around, because basically that's what they do all their life. So that in this case, somehow climate change would lead to more mobility. And that's also something which we really can see very often from other research in the Sahel region, in Sudan, for example. Indeed, there's this effect, but in this case, it was the other way around. So the Nyangatom, they had some places where water sources were depleted, and then they said, okay, it doesn't matter to go there anymore, because we don't have water there. So instead, they shifted more towards sorghum cultivation at the riverbank of the Omo River, which is a river which at least have some water all year round. So in this case, you somehow see the opposite, yeah? And that's what we can see very often in research. We have certain patterns, but we always find also examples which show the opposite, or kind of another direction. And that's what I wanted to illustrate with these introductory examples, that migration decisions, from my experience, are rarely unicausal, so there are always very different aspects which play a role at the same time, and that we really need also a holistic view on these migration decisions, and also the question how far they are related to climate change and environmental change. Yeah, maybe that's it for now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we did take our first boat ride a bit longer than what we had expected. The weather was unexpected. So I will ask your responses, dear podium members, to be brief for our second boat ride, so that we have the opportunity to hear from the audience. Pato or Paula, would you like to respond briefly?
Yeah, I will pick up something that Pato said, and she talked about migrants being treated as a liability. Migrants are not merely treated as a liability. Migrants are treated as a criminal today. Yet what happens is that if you look at some of the international declarations, we start with Human Rights Declaration, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. And it generated here, in the global north. And that declaration clearly says everybody has the right to move. Yet, when people move, they are treated as a criminal. That is why, when Pato says that they bring in actually resources, they take up jobs that people within the community will not take up. They are the service providers. They are the caretakers. The pandemic reflected on the massive amount of necessity in the care industry. Where is that? Where are the people coming for that industry? It is from that part of the world where when people come, you think they are criminals. They're actually the more resourced part of the world, because without resources, they will not come to Europe or United States. And only 10 to 15% have that kind of resources to move here. The rest, 85 to 90%, remain in the region that they have been forced to be displaced in. So that is why when they come, they bring in huge amount of social capital, huge amount of skills, huge amount of experiences. So it would behove well for us to utilize that experience, to utilize that skill. That would make the world a more just place. And the pandemic has shown us it is time now for us to think of the world, because we are in a precipice where we can go over the edge at any moment. And the Ukraine war has again showed us not all refugees are from the global south, not all refugees are poor, not all displaced people are racially different. Even in the places where you least expect refugees to originate from, there will be displaced people, there will be refugees. So we have to keep that in mind.
Thank you so much, Paula, also for bringing this dimension of rethinking about migration, right? And some people also ask us to think we can't have climate justice without advancing the rights of migrants, right? And thinking of them not only as a problem, but as a contribution, the social capital, as you've been wording it. Thank you so much. Can we hear from Pato? Anything you'd like to add on this short boat ride?
Sure. I think on the maladaptation that you spoke about, I want to connect it with a point that Prof. Paula spoke about earlier, when she spoke about when we respond, certain responses that don't work for women. So we all know when we talk about humans, usually we're talking about men. If it's not gendered, it means men. And when we talk about this will be a great adaptation, if it's not, you'll find that something which on paper should be great works for men and doesn't for women. So the same adaptation strategy can be maladaptative to women. But there's something that you said that I found quite interesting on the complexity of climate-fueled migration and basically just like the correlation that's drawn up. Definitely agree on that it's a multi-level and lots of contributors. But I found the examples quite interesting in that, let's say when we talk about the saving circles, for example, we spoke about conditions within the environment. So the people there, the saving circle, the way they chose to invest, what they chose to do with their money, and then they chose to leave. And even when we talk about the tribes, we're talking about the decisions that they make and so forth, which definitely contributes. But then I think my question then would be when we consider the different things that contribute to migration that then might be you know the word I'm trying to get to. Yes. Then do we then take into consideration the extraction that is happening, let's say just in Ethiopia or Horn of or in the Horn or just Africa? So a lot of the companies, most of the biggest companies in Africa are not African. A lot of those profits are being repatriated to EU and the like. And these are possibly funds that could have been used to build the resilience necessary to not have to leave. So the family that's part of the saving circle, when we look at contributing factors, do we look at do we also consider the lack of taxes paid to their governments, which would have allowed them to build certain cushions for their people? Do we also consider the point of how much influence outside parties have on policies and just what happens in Ethiopia and what happens on the African continent? And are those some of the factors that are then taken into consideration when we talk about the complexity? I bring that in because of the example that you brought up. So it brought up that curiosity for me. That's it from me.
Thank you, Pato. So as if it wouldn't be complicated enough, here you add a couple more layers about questions of responsibility. And as you said, often when we talk about the complexity of migration decisions, also a common reply is, what do you mean decision? People are forced. Like when we talk about the complexity of migration, the process of decision making to migrate or not, this doesn't mean that we are brushing away structural inequality, right? Or historical patterns that enable or not migration. And again, when we think about forced and voluntary, let me invite us today to think about it as a wide spectrum with, and not even a line, right? This will vary across time, depending on intersectional aspects of social groups, which will also vary across time and space. But that was just a little added little input from my side that I wanted to put in now before I give you the floor to either reply to this question, yeah, sure. More complexity.
Yeah, I mean, I will reply to your question, and also what you kind of I have another point to make later on. Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. The global inequalities is an extra layer to put to that, right? I mean, when we look at examples at migration decisions, we try to look at it from a quite very neutral standpoint at the beginning, and then try to kind of find out all the dimensions, and then see if and how far we can frame it and analyze it. The question of tax you raised, for example, that's pointing towards responsibilities, which are, of course, I mean, to some climate injustice, there are responsibilities, especially in the global north, because we were consuming quite a lot and emitting CO2 emissions. So what is happening in Ethiopia and in other parts of the world is a huge responsibility within the global north. But when you mentioned the tax, for example, where you would be able to kind of steer local adaptation measures maybe in a much better direction. I think it's also important to mention also local responsibilities. Yeah, I mean Ethiopian politics, for example, which is of course also important to look at. But I mean that would make it really extremely complicated to look at all these layers. Yeah, so it's quite challenging. And the second point. I wanted to say, I mean, from your inputs, I just realized also kind of, or what I find interesting is that the gender aspect, which is very important, these adaptation measures are very often done with the aim to empower women, and in these saving circles, only women can be. So unfortunately, I could not do interviews with these families who vanished, but I really could imagine that this also creates a certain tension within the family, because I mean, then it's the woman who has the responsibility for being in this saving circle, and then being part of this situation where kind of maybe they got them into, and I think it's a very important point.
Yeah. I want to raise something here, and that is even when women are supposed to be the repository of a program like microcredit, within the family, the gender structure is such that it is the men that often act it out through the women. So we have to keep that aspect in mind as well. Yeah. I'm not saying that women are not strong enough to do it, but we sleep with the enemy, if there is an enemy. So, you know, there is that dynamics also within a family. So, you know, one has to look at what society we are talking about, what is the socialization process, and then see how much of it is what the women want. Because I worked on repatriation, and I've seen how women's voices are sort of taken out of that.
Thank you, Paula. Any more responses from the podium or questions? Or
I mean, now we have talked quite a lot about the situation of kind of more involuntary. I don't like the term forced migration, because I think it's also a continuum. Migration can be voluntary at the beginning and turn into something forced and unwanted. But I think we also should consider that migration as adaptation, voluntary migration can also be a quite important form of adaptation. And in these cases, it can also really improve the situation of household contexts. And that is something I think is also really important to consider when we discuss this relationship.
Thank you, Simon. Anything else from the podium?
I might, but it's okay. We'll hold back.
No. I did announce a short ride for the second one, because when we were preparing for today's evening, we were thinking it would be wonderful to also, in the spirit of coming back after COVID, of hearing some of your responses or doubts or comments or questions So with this, I would like to open the floor for questions. Again, we can have questions in English or responses or comments, but we can also have them in German, and we have a translation provided. Do we have questions? Yes, we have something in the back. Yes.
People who have to leave their homes due to climate issues, do you think it would be possible or needed to have a new international legal document about those people, or do you think it's already enough and we can use those we already have on the, for example, European Convention on Human Rights in Europe, or, yeah, I don't know.
Thank you. The million-dollar question we've been asking ourselves a lot during these 15 years, perhaps. Who would like to tackle this one first?
I can go.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. Paula, then
Actually,
Simon.
I just came up with one of the ILO briefs on just transition and migrant workers. So it just came out today. So that's why, I'm excited to talk about it. We also have the Global Compact. The question is not with the mechanisms or a compact or a treaty. The question is actually with the will. Does the international community have the will to have a safe process of migration? Because people don't want to go venture on unsafe measures. People are desperate enough to be driven into it. People don't want to be documented or undocumented. I hate the term illegal because people cannot be illegal. Commodities can be. But people can be undocumented, but who wants to be undocumented, knowing there's so much of abuse in the way? So it is the will of the states that guides this, that has the power to guide it. They have to decide what they want to do. And we, at the most, can be advocates in trying to push for a fairer process of migration, a more just process of transition.
Thank you, Paula. Simon.
Yeah, maybe very shortly, because I understood also the question with regard to people who kind of are forced or kind of have to leave due to climate change. I mean, I think one of the big and Christmas is approaching, so if I had a wish to Santa Claus, I know it's quite unrealistic. But if you look at the Geneva Convention, which is kind of declaring which reasons are accepted as a reason for asylum, there are no environmental factors in that. And seen also on the global level the injustices we have, who is responsible for climate change, etc. I think that really should be a reason which should be integrated into the convention. But this process, I mean, is discussed already since many years, and what we can see that there's extremely little movement with regard to these efforts to change that, because it would have really huge implications, because suddenly countries wouldn't be able to simply deny people at their borders, because it's playing a role in so many places in the world. So, it would be kind of a miracle if that would change. Yeah.
Pato, would you like to tackle this one? I know I have a lot to say.
I'm good.
Yeah.
We'll get more.
So
We've been talking.
It was a simply formulated question, but the answer is much more complicated, right? And it goes like you're pointing out, not only is it a normative question, do we need such an agreement, but it's also a strategic question. Is this the moment to bring up to the international community an instrument like the Refugee Convention? What kind of results can we expect in today's political climate if we put it up to debate? Are we going to get more protections? Or what are we going to get? So
because 51 got the non-refoulement, see? Still, do we follow the non-refoulement? Every country deports now.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for seeing the hand. Okay. Could you, I think I'd rather take several questions, like one question and answer, to have it a dialogue.
I think let's take a bunch. So
you
that
want to
we
take
can,
a bunch?
yes, yeah,
Okay.
so that we can accommodate more questions.
Okay, so let's take two questions together. We have a gentleman here in the front. Would you take the microphone? And we have somebody in the back. I've seen two people for this round.
I am basically lacking the words to understand and appreciate the complaints you were raising. This is absolutely true. It is the greatest injustice in the world. and it has developed in the last, whatever, 100 years or so. And as a Caucasian, I feel terrible because we are on the ruling side, if you like. But my question is really, given that this is the situation and given that so much of despair has been expressed, what is the solution? Is the world just hoping that we will be 4 billion less people and then everything will be fine? Or what is the solution? I mean, here are powerful women on the board, and tell me what you want. Why do you not go to Egypt and take all these people ransom and don't let them out unless something positive is being decided?
We're making notes. Thank you. We have one more question in the back to the left. We're going to get 2 questions in this round.
Okay. Hello. Thank you. I actually have a question for Pato because you talked about the agreement in East Africa to host refugees or displaced people. Did it ever got to action at them already or not? And if yes, did it actually work? Because in theory, we have in Austria or Europe a quota system, but it doesn't work. So I would be really interested if it's really working in other parts of the world, or, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So for this first round, we have 2 questions. I'm going to briefly reformulate them. The first one was, what is the solution? What do we want? Santa is listening. And the second one is the Kampala Declaration, has it been already implemented? What are the experiences on that front? Who would like to start with the solution?
Let's be democratic. Pato can start.
Perfect.
Okay, I'll start with the question from the person at the back. The Kampala Declaration hasn't been actioned yet. So it's a 2022 declaration, so it's quite recent. But with the way that the climate extreme disasters are happening, it's probably going to be actioned soon, unfortunately. So maybe in a couple of months, unfortunately, we will know if it's working and being executed as agreed. And then when it comes to solutions, I think having done a bit of work around the loss and damage finance facility, I think what we would like to see, one is accountability, and then with the accountability we can move to solutions. Right now we are putting solutions forward. We need a loss and damage finance facility. In terms of, let's say, the mines that are in Africa, we need global northern countries to follow the same human rights that they follow in global northern companies. In terms of the extraction that's happening for all these minerals that are going to lead the green revolution and give us electric cars, we need human rights to be around that. It can't just be extraction. Go and build the factories in your DRCs and so forth, where you can monitor that the human rights are being respected, where you can monitor that the thing that the entire green plan for the global north is based on is not costing lives and livelihoods. And then with the loss and damage facility, the only way that we're going to get that, the reason I start at accountability before we even get to loss and damage, is that for as long as the global north is saying we're not responsible, yeah, it happened, is what it is, let's start talking about who's contributing to climate change from the time when African countries gave coal licenses three years ago without looking at how long that extraction has been happening. Then there's that out of, yes, we did it, but it's not our responsibility. When people take responsibility, when they take accountability, then they will act in the way that they need to. This whole thing of, but we're also victims, isn't working. And then you were talking about how, as a Caucasian man, you lucky duck, like the most powerful person, the most powerful type of person that exists out there, a man and white. But what you can do beyond that, what you can do beyond feeling bad is you have a lot of influence by virtue of just those two factors. You have a lot of influence. In your spaces of influence, what are you doing to ensure that the climate actions that are enforced are based on justice? It's not just a thing of let's go and do climate action. You, after this talk, to some degree, are now alive to the fact that not all climate action is climate justice. You have the power in the room where you're the only one who's been here to bring in that justice factor that is aware of what's happening in India, that is aware of what's happening in Botswana, that's aware of what's happening across the African continent and the global south, to bring that into the room and make sure that the knowledge that you now have is part of the decisions that are being made. So that's how you can contribute. And then, yeah. That was a bit.
Thank you. Thank you. Simon or Paula, would you like to add to the solutions part?
Okay, sure. Yes, I mean, look at the Qatar World Cup Stadium. You know, how many people died building it because of extreme heat? Do we talk about it? No. It's talked about, but have we done anything for it? Any actions?
Against it, but what does it help? We can go to the street, all the rest of it. So what does it? There is a system change necessary. I mean, it's talking on the surface of it.
No, madam. Movements bring in change. And you are an unbeliever of going to the streets. I believe in going to the streets. The only way that we got our political rights was by going to the street. And really, one major change that you have done by coming here is to listen. We do not find people giving us that respect. So when I talk about dignity, you have the entire ability to give dignity to people who have migrated because of climate change. And that means a lot, believe me. And because it is not always questions of bread and butter that hurts people most. It's a question of their dignity. And please understand that when people come, they come with resources. They come to give their resources, they also come to take back certain resources for their homes. And that is a just process. So, you know, if your local council member gives speeches about treating migrants like criminals, please stop them. You have that right to do it. You have the right to say to your local council members that we will not accept a behavior of indignity, whether that indignity is being shown to people who are citizens of this country or the citizens of this world. We all have enormous power, so there's nothing to despair. And when we are talking about it, we have moved one step beyond despair. We are trying to make changes. That is why we have flown from Africa, from India, to come and talk to you. We know that you don't need convincing, otherwise you wouldn't have invited us, but we wanted to share our experiences because what we have faced is something that we know, and we can at least tell you stories about it so that you feel moved, because the solution lies neither with me nor with you. It lies with us together as a community.
Thank you very much. Pato wants to add a little bit before. Simon, do you want to say something to the solutions afterwards?
On the what can we do? Is there a point in it? So like Prof. Paula said, movements bring in change. So from where we are, we don't have the luxury of being hopeless. The only thing, because the reality right now is not something that can be accepted. We can't be hopeless, because hopeless means where we are now is going to be the lived reality forever. If you look at any change that has ever happened, it started from something small. It's a snowball effect. It's tiny and then it grows. When we become hopeless, then there's no point.
Thank you very much. So a word for hope. Simon, would you like to add to the, you don't have to, we can take the next round of questions unless you want to respond to the solution.
Yeah, maybe very short. I mean, I think finding the solution on a very global level is really hard because it's so abstract, and you go in one direction, you miss out a whole lot of other directions and measures. But what I think what is important to look in what is the arena, the social arena where we are in, and what can I do here? And for example, here in Europe, I'm coming from Germany. We have a quite right-wing party which is denying climate change. That's something where we could start, for example, writing to the people responsible for our constituencies and asking them, how do you see the situation? How can you be responsible also for your politics you are posting out there? That could be something which is more specific, where we could kind of put a pressure also into the political system, where it's maybe a more direct way to do it. But of course, it needs a lot of people and a lot of kind of this pressure until then it trickles up to the global system. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all these contributions. When I heard the question, what is the solution, my first thought was, we can't have one. If you take something out of today's conversation, I hope it is the fact that we're looking at a complex beast with many heads and tails and legs, and therefore I don't believe we'll find a solution, but certainly find a million in different sizes, colors, techniques, places, time spans, right? When we talk about international conventions, for instance, as the question in the back, we need to think of a different kind of time frame as of when we think of a solution for what am I doing this week with my yield that has failed, with my paddy that is not planted, right? Thank you. I would like to take 3 questions for this next round. I see a hand in the back, in the side. Do I have a third hand? And a third hand. Perfect. So we've identified our 3 inputs for this next round. Thank you.
I want to just stress again your question in the back. And Simon Bunchuay, he mentioned the Geneva Convention. And I don't know, my wie sagt man, Sorge?
Concern.
Yes, thank you. My concern would be that it's tactically not very wise to open the Geneva Convention for refugees due to the climate catastrophe, because those right-wing politicians who are gaining more and more power in Europe, they even want to get rid of the Geneva Convention. We had discussions in Austria by conservative politicians saying it's not here to stay. Who said that it's going to be forever? So already they're trying to get rid of the Geneva Convention so that refugees who come here due to political reasons will get problems soon. So I would really suggest to find another way by law to open up for refugees who come due to the climate catastrophe. I wouldn't call it climate change. It's a very weird word, right? The change is already here. It's a climate catastrophe. Good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was our first question for this round, and we had a hand here. Hi.
Thank you. This actually fits to what she said. I was just wondering what your opinion is. I don't know how much it pertains to your own research, but what your opinion is on exploring like alternative migration methods, such as circular migration or porous borders, or as she said, regional corporations as a solution. I mean, it's not a solution, but as like a viable option.
Thank you very much. And we had on this side of the room another hand. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Barbara Steiner. I'm from Transform Europe, a European network for alternative thinking and political dialogue. I thank you very much for these very interesting contributions. I learned a lot, and thanks for organizing this event. I feel that something is not outspoken, but it's always included in your contributions, and this is capitalism and class. I hear you talking about inequalities, but inequalities do not come only from one is born poor, the other born rich, or from some people being more greedy than the others. Inequality is a result of capitalism, and it is inherent of capitalism, as it is also war, for example, as I think climate change is also, and here I come to what I learned also now today again, that the multi-headed beast cannot be compartmentalized. Yeah, I just wanted to say the word out loud.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to recap our 3 questions or invitations for this round, and that is the concern of opening, which we addressed briefly, the concern of opening up the Refugee Convention at this stage. What is that in the right-wing political ambiance, calling the climate crisis a climate catastrophe, if we consider including that? Then what about different forms of migration? Perhaps there is the idea out there that migration means moving from A to B as a linear thing, and there's a clear A and there's a clear B, and there's just that one moment. It takes many more shapes, and you're going to tell us a little bit about what it has already taken, and perhaps what can we imagine what forms we can imagine that it can take. And the elephant in the room, capitalism. Who would like to start? One of the elephants. We have a herd.
Maybe I start.
Simon, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, you're totally right. From a strategical point of view, it's somehow a very difficult issue, and it can be abused as well, yeah, the whole debate. My wish was more a normative wish, and also with regard to the more global view. I mean, it can, if we only look at the European situation or at specific situations in certain countries, it also can block us from thinking a bit outside of the box. And yeah, but it's still important to consider these political realities, which are actually also not only in Europe. You find them also in many other countries, especially with regard to migration. Yeah. So the second part, the alternative migration concepts. I mean, and you framed it nicely. Kind of, we often have this basic idea: migration is starting somewhere and going somewhere. What we look at is at translocality. It's a fancy scientific concept, but what is basically behind is that we have to better understand that when people go from one place to another, they keep, in most cases, they keep the relations where they come from. And these relations, there's a lot of stuff going on. Yeah, so it's not only money they send back home, but it's also what we call social remittances. So it's ideas, it's knowledge, it's concepts. Yeah, gender, for example, gender concepts. People go to other contexts, social contexts, get to know a whole different gender concept, and also shifting gender roles can come into play. Ideas about how to deal with, maybe to make it very specific, in our research in Thailand, we have seen quite many migrants going to Israel as in the agricultural sector. So they get to know drip irrigation, which is a much more water efficient system of growing crops. They earn money there and go back and bring this idea of drip irrigation back. When of course you have to adjust it also to the context then where you are. Of course in Israel they're using really fancy computers to calculate how much water to use where. You would never use that in Thailand. So the next step is also then to adapt it to that situation. So I think it's very important also to look at these translocal connections when we look at migration, and not only see migration as a problem, like okay, there's climate change somewhere and then people go, but it's also part of the solution, as I just mentioned with this example. And then also the point climate crisis versus climate change. I agree. Yes, there are situations where we should call it climate crisis, but there are also moments where
catastrophe.
Catastrophe. Yes. So in some parts, yeah, in the Ahrtal, for example, in Germany, in that situation, but in other situations, not. Not everything is damage and death and everything. There are also situations where actually people are quite profiting from the impacts of climate change. So I would say both things exist at the same time and then appear in different moments. Yeah.
Thank you, Simon. Do I have from this side of the room responses?
Tiny one.
Yeah.
It's just on the last point. The naming of the elephants in the room. I think if we're going to name the capitalist elephant, we definitely need to put a name on the colonialism elephant as well. That's my only comment. Yeah.
Very small comment. Opening the can of worms. No, actually, I think it would be very foolish to tamper with the Geneva Convention, Refugees Convention, 51. I was a consultant for UNHCR in 2000 when we were toying with the idea. And believe me, none of us could come up with a good reason to do it. We could go the statelessness path. There's a different convention for statelessness. We could go the Global Compact path, or we could do the IDP, you know, the guiding principles path. So there are many other examples of dealing with climate change. You know, we don't necessarily have to call people who suffer from climate change climate refugees. We can invent a different terminology. The problem is not with compacts or terminologies or anything like that. It is the problem of the will to do something about it. And yes, sure, we have different migration pattern, circular migration, straight migration, but you know, this whole notion of migration being sanitized and displacement being problematic is a false notion. So that's why even in UN parlance today, we've come up with the notion of mixed and massive flows. So, you know, where would statelessness land us in? How, if we are talking of just migration, what happens to the Rohingyas? You know, I was doing research on different jails for women in India, you know, penitentiaries, and looking at Bangladeshi women caught there. When I came across 10 Rohingya women, the term for, to act against the Foreigners Act is just 2 years of penitentiary. But these women were in India for more than 5 years because the government of India could not repatriate them to Myanmar. They are stateless population. So, you know, there are so many levels of complexities. So what I'm saying is it doesn't matter whether we are looking at different patterns of migration. Migration has multiple patterns. What are we willing to accept? That is the thing. What are we willing to say that when people migrate, why do they migrate? We have to come to that understanding ourselves. So, you know, alternatives exist. We've been talking of alternatives for over 2 decades now, but we have to make our minds that alternatives will be accepted as solutions. That is the problem. I mean, this morning I was talking to Pato about it. I was in Paris, I was in Copenhagen, a strong believer in COP, and I'm so happy to see that she's going to COP27, but I don't any longer feel the urge. I feel that younger people should come to it and think of it. Our generation have already talked about COPs, but we haven't been able to extract the results that we have wanted. But that is not why we have to stop. We have to inspire the next generation to carry the baton. And if we make a change in one person's life, there is that 1+.
Thank you very much, Paula. Thank you also for that question. If I may also... I also wanted to bring up the point that we could call it alternative, but if we actually look at with a bit of a historical depth, when did borders arise? When were they drawn on the map that, as we know it today, right? When we can think of different types of movement beyond what we know now as a passport or a visa. Of course, there are ideas of thinking of a world without borders. What did that look like? What we could look at history and see how did we benefit from that? How did it function? How was it organized? Doesn't necessarily have to be an entirely new, untested idea. In fact, it's not so radical, I think. Can we move to a final round? I know we're coming close to an end. I would like to open one more time to the audience if there's any pressing messages, responses, questions, doubts? Claudia, thank you very much.
Maybe a short comment, because I was so impressed that there were several examples of political possibilities, and when there is a will, like we had in the COVID crisis. It was mentioned with the Ukraine refugees, where Europe allowed a mass immigration, so for the first time, but this could be a precedent, could be repeated in other contexts. And also the Eastern African initiative, which I did not know about, and we don't yet know how it will work, but there are options, and I think to contribute to this political will, although we do have so much backlash, it's still important. And also remittances, I mean, it's just to mention 3 times more than the development cooperation globally. So,
thank you very much for that comment. Claudia, responses to this comment from our podium?
Can I just tell a story? We developed a sub-regional dialogue between India, Bangladesh, and Nepal, as a result of which we had the India-Nepal Friendship Treaty, where there is no borders. So a Nepalese coming into India, if displaced, will be considered as internally displaced. So I think that's a very good practice, because the thing is, the countries where migrants are coming to work, that country has every right to tax these people, the same level as the citizen is paying. And so if they are taxed as much as a citizen, then they should also be given, you know, what the citizen is given in terms of, support system. And that will draw the entire movement over ground, that you can come if you pay your taxes and then take back what is yours. Because keeping it underground does not solve anybody's problem other than that of global capital. You know, the captains of the industry wants it underground because these people would be your captive labor to work for pittance. So the states have to realize that they should really move this whole movement overground.
Thank you, Paula. Pato, Simon? Simon?
Go ahead.
Mine is completely unrelated. I just want to say I really like that microphone when you give it to someone. It looks like a rock star show. You guys need to watch it. But that's all I had to say. Simon, please. I absolutely love it. You have to watch it.
I wanted to respond also to this question of political will. I was trying then to transfer that to the situation of Singapore, where I also worked, which is the country which has one of the most fascinating management system of migrants, in a sense. I think it's not only about kind of fostering political will, but it's also about the normative question, where should political decision go to? Because in Singapore is very famous as a country where other governments would go to look how to properly manage migration, because Singapore is able, and is one of the very few countries, is able to steer migration flows on a weekly basis, on a sectoral basis. So they can say, we want Chinese, or we want, not so many Chinese actually anymore, we want Indians or Burmese people, and we have a certain quota per company, and so they can steer that, and they have regular meetings every month, and that's how precise they can steer how many people are coming to Singapore and not. And I know that there are regular meetings with other governments who want to learn from this immigration system from Singapore. So there's not only kind of the positive political will side of kind of improving the situation of migrants, but there's also the other side, how to manage migrants and how to decide what they can do, how they can stay, etc. And I think it's one step, kind of trying to bring something into role in the political sphere, but it's also a question of society, which solutions do we want to have, and exactly, yes.
Exactly.
Sorry that I fall into your
No problem.
I'm a little bit puzzled now, because it's a nice word to say managing the migration. We always want to manage something, but it's Singapore, as we know, is a
fast-driving economy, and they need people to make their slavery jobs. So of course they try to get people in.
Totally agreed. That's why I said quotation marks. Yeah.
And that's one of the challenges, right? How do we, that this brings up again the topic about dignity and migrant, so workers' rights, migrant or not, right? Workers' right, not just the needs of companies, right? How many workers do we need today, but what kind of working conditions do I want as a worker, migrant or not? If there are no other pressing questions from the audience, I don't see an urge of hands. Nothing else from the audience? Okay. We're not taking questions digitally today, are we?
No.
No? Okay. We're not. Okay. So then I would like to ask you for, we have perhaps suspicion, I think was the word you said, Michael, which is appropriate, I think, for what COP27 can do and what it can't do, right? But giving the context that this is taking place right now, that the topic is so hot on the headlines, on the Twitter hashtags, et cetera, I would like to ask you, not thinking only of member states and what can be signed or not signed, but what would be some of the key messages that you would like to see more, that you would like to hear louder, thinking of COP27 and thinking of the topics we've discussed today? I wrote down a bunch of keywords, but let me bring up some which are dignity, rights, justice, responsibility. Okay, peace, we're adding. And let's keep it at these 5 for now, yes? So I'll give you a couple minutes to close your, what messages do we need to get louder there? We heard a little bit at one point of actions, right? You can share these visions in a room, you can write to your representatives. Now I'd like you to think about messages for COP. Not for COP. In the framework of COP, when the world is looking and talking about the climate crisis and what needs to be done, of course, we've heard about loss and damage. Who'd be ready? Simon, okay.
Maybe I start. I mean, it's a good question, but it's also quite hard. I mean, to come with this powerful and strong message. I'm also quite skeptical about COPs. To some extent, I really get the sense that you can reach more when you are in the same room with other people, and you can agree on some steps, maybe more consistently if you are in the same room together. But there is some example where I think COPs also changed something in the international debate. For example, with regard to climate change as adaptation, migration as adaptation. Sorry, few years ago in the early 2000s, that was not such a big topic. It was only talked about kind of displacement and migration as something negative. And this mainstreaming of migration as adaptation is something which really took place on the stage of Conference of Parties. That's something. But then also maybe some kind of urgent need I see with regard to the international community and how we look at migration is with regard to how we assess migration. So if we look at the numbers, currently we have 48.1% of international migrants are women and 51.9% are men. If you count that together, that makes 100% of international migrants are women or men. So we are leaving completely out people with diverse genders. So we never actually, we talk a lot about genders, but what is actually meant or what is actually looked at is only sex, male or female. And we have a huge blind spot with regard to how people with diverse genders kind of migrate. They are also affected, in many cases, face even additional burdens and problems. And I think we need also rethinking with regard to how we assess migration and also which kind of knowledge we create there.
Thank you very much, Simon, for adding that. The blind spots, yes, we need to be careful with that. From this side, Paula or Pato? Pato.
Okay, wait, that was themes that we need to get from COP27.
Messages that you'd like to hear louder in this framework, in this time, in these couple of weeks when...
Okay, I just did it a different way, so I wrote some points, but mine is just around theme, well, sorry to change your question, but kind of themes and what we need from COP27. I mean, we need a lot, but I think some of the things that are detrimental to the continuation of this conversation is, for one, teamwork, and we need to see not just commitment, but we need to now start moving to seeing those commitments become action. We always say this, but we actually need to see this if there's going to be a point of a COP28 and a COP30 and so forth. We need to keep alive the hope in the process and the trust in the process that there'll be some sort of results. For as long as we don't trust the process, for as long as we don't have any hope that there's a point to COP and the COPs that are to come, then there's no point in it. So right now, when there's a lot of skepticism around the COPs, which rightly so, there should be a lot of skepticism seeing the reality of what's been said and what's been done to date. So this is one of those really important COPs where COP cements what it is. Is it a talk shop, or is it somewhere where action happens? And then I think another big one that we need, will need to see, and we'll need to see at COP27 is trust. For as long as we don't trust the process, there's no point in it. Because even if people come and make commitments, and we don't trust that those commitments will be actioned, what's the point? If countries come and say, we will pledge 100 billion, but we don't trust that we'll see it. If we come and say, yes, we'll do a loss and damage facility, but everything historically says that this will not come to pass, then what is the point? So as we go to COP, we're going to need teamwork, we're going to need trust, we're going to need commitment to action, and we're going to need to keep the hope alive in the COP process. Literally, we're going to need to. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Pato. Paula?
Yeah, my two-bit is, I'm not so much concerned about the process. I'm more concerned about the people. 1,400 people are going. Why are they going? You know, and the whole purpose is that people have a platform to demand, and we will keep demanding. We will, if this COP does not happen, we will find out venues where we are heard. And that is why, for me, it is not just the process, it's the trust in the people and the ability for people to change agendas into action. And that has happened in the women's movement. So it's not as if there is no movement where it has happened. It has happened in the women's movement. From my grandmother's time to my time, there has been massive changes. And if the demand is strong, and if we are united, one of the reasons why the gender movement worked was because women from all over the world participated in it. And we have to realize that climate change or issues of peace or issues of respect or issues of dignity are not just for one country. If I am affected, you are affected too. So we have to, as a thinking, feeling community, come together and demand it from our government, because the trust is with the people and not with the government.
Thank you very much, Paula. I think this deserves a round of applause. We're not finished, but... Those were some messages. Those influencers around us, you can pick up on some hashtags and help us spread the word in social media. It's going to be difficult for me to summarize or recap all that has been said. As I did bring up at one point today, if you take anything from today, take the fact that this is a complicated issue, a complex issue, and that there will be not one solution, but perhaps a whole array of different solutions with different time horizons to be implemented. We started our journey today hearing from what it looks like, what does it feel like in South Asia, what does it feel like, what does it look like in Africa, What does it feel like and look like in Africa as well? Thailand, a little bit of Asia, we heard. We tried to keep, we had a couple examples from particular places, but we did keep our dialogue today pretty international, global, and some of the later statements today really referred to transnational solidarity and the political possibilities, as Claudia brought it up. In the middle, we heard a lot of responses, and I'm going to throw a couple of keywords that I think were very important. Again, dignity, dignity for people displaced, dignity for people on the move, dignity for people. Adaptation and maladaptation, let's be careful with those keywords. Health, issues of health beyond COVID, for instance. Responsibility, taxes, financing, this is also a key issue. The problem between compartmentalizing development, right, a gender issue, a migration issue. It's actually very interesting when we look at documents and the evolution of this agenda and how more and more we see people and institutions citing each other, but still not yet, the bridges are still to be built, yes. Something that we didn't bring up today, and the time was short, as somebody brought up, is, for instance, disaster risk reduction. This is something that we've been working as society for decades. It's not entirely new, it's not unique to the climate crisis. We have expertise on it, we have institutions on it at national level. And yet, the disaster risk reduction community is not always in dialogue with the climate change adaptation community, with the migrant rights community, with the gender transformative movement. So we still have lots of bridges to build, is what I'm trying to get at. We also heard about possibilities at the regional level to lean on regionally. Perhaps we don't need an international convention to address this particular intersection. Perhaps in some cases, regional agreements make sense. Something to continue to think on. And a wider challenge, especially for us sitting in Europe, is to rethink how we perceive, how we frame migration. Is it a problem? When we're asking questions, are we asking them in a way that the answers are always going to be responsive to this problem? Or are we asking questions about what are these people bringing to the societies that they make their lives a part of, right? Perhaps your neighbor, your baker, your teacher, your partner have a series of different capitals and translocal ties that enrich, actually, the places that we are living. We talked also about how complex migration decisions are, how messy it can be. It's rarely an A to B, right? If we would, perhaps after when we're a little bit more relaxed after this event, we're going to share in a more personal manner all of the if we would trace all of the movements that the people in this room have been through, we're certainly not going to end up with an A to B kind of pattern. We've also heard about how important it is to address this issue in a holistic manner. And that's the challenge because it's so complicated. We need to think about migrants' rights, we need to think about health. Something that we also often forget is not only how climate change impacts the mobility or immobility of people, but also how people on the move impact the environment. The consumption of resources because of massive shelters, for instance, or the unorganized use of resources, or the relocation of people in an unsafe location that then gets flooded, which is one of the cases that I was confronted with in Indonesia, right? These people were displaced because of a catastrophe and placed exactly for the next one. How do we think about that? We also talked a little bit about the issue of criminalization, right? What would it mean to have a system where, going back to something as fundamental, and I'm going to close with this, something as fundamental as the Human Rights Declaration, the right to move. I invite you to think about this for the rest of the evening. Let's just stay with that one. Beyond meta, multi-level agreements, what if we would think and focus on the right for movement, the right to move? And on a second closing thought, there's a new kind of right that has been officially declared, and that is also the right to a healthy environment. So two very simple and fundamental rights to think about for either your advocacy or your actions. With that, I would like to close tonight's evening. Thank you so much to our guests with all your experience, expertise, passion, and thank you for naming some of the elephants. We rode on a couple boats with elephants such as capitalism, colonialism, and racism, which we're going to have to tackle from our different fronts. Once a class, thank you, we talked about class. With this, I would really now like to close today's evening, and thank you very much for your participation, for being today, and again to VIDC and WIDE for organizing this wonderful panel. Thank you.